All right, everybody, we're back for more Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And this time we're going to be on chapter 7, but I'm not going to stick too close to the text here. There's a rather famous argument in chapter 7, probably one of the two more famous arguments in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Little review first about where we are so far. Aristotle thinks in order to do ethics, you have to figure out what the good is. Right? Everything we do is aimed at the good. Well, what's the good? He has certain formal conditions on what can count as the good. And so to remind you, those are things like completeness, self-sufficiency, and desired for itself. Completeness and self-sufficiency. So self-sufficiency is all by itself. The good will, whatever the good is, will give you what you want, right? There won't be anything else that you need in order to make your life good if you achieve the good, if you have either the activity or the product that leads to a good life. Right? Completeness means not only does it by itself get you a good life, you're not missing anything. Right? So not only do you not need anything else, there's nothing else that would make life any better. And desired for itself really just means there's nothing else that you want it for. Right? So he thinks those are formal conditions. Any candidate you give for this is what the good is, this is what we're all after, has to meet those conditions. And he considers three potential lives: the lives of pleasure, the life of I'll call it public virtue. I think I would call it something like that before, and the life of contemplation. I want to point out here that these are basically the same three lives that Plato considered. Pleasure, Plato did not think much of at all. Outside of the Protagoras, the Protagoras is that weird dialogue where Socrates is a hedonist and it doesn't fit with anything else Plato wrote. Or at least that part of the Protagoras doesn't fit with anything else Plato wrote. Mostly Plato's attitude towards the life of pleasure-seeking is very negative. But if you remember from the cave, right, when you get up and out of the cave and you see the world as it is, you want to spend all your time up there out of the cave. That is, you want to spend all your time thinking about what's truly real, the forms. But duty calls you to go back down into the cave and try to enlighten others, to try to help them live good lives. That's basically a competition between the life of public virtue and the life of contemplation. And Plato makes clear that the life, or here's what Plato seems to say anyway, the life of contemplation is better for the individual, but they have a duty to engage in the life of public virtue anyway. As I pointed out, that raises some troubling questions about the extent to which Plato actually has a eudaimonistic ethical theory. If at the end he's saying, well, of course it'd be better for you to just sit around thinking about the forms all day, but you have a duty to go do what's going to help other people. But at this point, I just want to point out these three lives are the main three lives Plato considered. Pleasure to be ruled out as, unworthy of us. Public virtue and contemplation as both good in their own way. And what we're going to see is that same tension appears in Aristotle. Okay, so he's got the formal conditions. And the idea is people have made the case that all three of these lives meet those conditions, right? So you could say that you desire pleasure for its own sake. You don't desire pleasure so you can get something else out of it. And some people have thought, hedonists think, if you have a life full of pleasure, there's nothing else you need, right? Pleasure's enough. And if you have all the pleasure you could have, then there's nothing else you could add to your life to make it better. There are people who think pleasure meets the three formal requirements on the good. But of course, there's people who don't. And we'll get into that a little more as we go on. But Aristotle, by chapter 7, it comes back to this. He says, okay, happiness, he kind of recapitulates what he said before. Happiness is the good, but we don't quite know what happiness is. So he introduces the function argument. The idea is the function argument is supposed to tell us or give us a better idea about what human happiness or the human good consists in. All right, so let's go here. So I said I wasn't going to stick too close to the text. I didn't so much lie as I just want to get started with the text and then we'll get off of it, right? So this is the section I'm talking about. Presumably, however, to say that happiness is the chief good seems a platitude, and a clearer account of what it is still desired. This might perhaps be given if we could first ascertain the function of man. For just as for a flute player, a sculptor, an artist, or in general, for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in function. So would it seem to be for man, if he has a function. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, Aristotle's noting that a very common way we use good is what you might call an attributive use of good, or what philosophers have called the attributive use of good. So like if you ask what makes for a good car, right? Well, what makes for a good car is it runs reliably. Maybe it can go fast if you need it to. It stops when you need it to. So it's like it's got a function. The car's got a job to do. Its job is to get you from point A to point B safely. And a car that does that is better than a car that doesn't. That's the difference between a good car and a bad car. A bad car is one that will just like die on you in the middle of the interstate, or one that is very unsafe, right? So you won't get to point B from point A because you die on the way, right? So that's the function of a car, and so we determine which cars are better than other cars by reference to that function, right? Also, people work this way. He uses the example of people in their jobs. A good, let's say, well, a good teacher is one who imparts information and or skills to students in a way that they retain, right? Why? Because that's the function of a teacher. The function of a teacher is to impart information and or skills to students, hopefully in a lasting way. So a teacher is a good teacher if they do that well, and they're a bad teacher if they don't do that well. This example strikes a bit close to home. But if you want to know whether someone's a good basketball player, right? You might say, well, the job of a basketball player is to help their team win, right? Basketball's a team game. So one basketball player is better than another to the extent that they do more to contribute to their team winning. Okay. You have a function, or rather you, while you're performing your job, have a function. A doctor is supposed to save people's lives, or a doctor who does save people's lives is a good doctor. A doctor who doesn't save people's lives is a bad doctor. And Aristotle suggests maybe it's not just us in our professions, maybe it's us in general. Maybe human beings have a function, right? Or a purpose. Another way of thinking about this is purpose. The word for function is ergon, so sometimes this is called the ergon argument. And what this is part of is a general worldview of Aristotle's, one that we don't typically share today. Aristotle thought everything in the world had a purpose or a natural end. Everything had something it was supposed to do, something it was supposed to be. And in fact, that purpose is what makes something the kind of thing that it is, right? So what makes you a human being is the fact that you have a certain purpose. What makes a rooster is that it has a certain purpose. What makes wheat is that it has a certain purpose. Even what makes a rock is that it has a certain purpose. Everything, even non-living things, according to Aristotle, have a purpose, or telos. So function is ergon, and purpose, I wrote that horribly. It's telos. Telos can also mean end, or goal. Right? It can mean a lot of things. Now, we don't tend to think this much anymore. I mean, we do think that some things have purposes. So like, here's the mouse that I use, right? A wireless mouse. We think it has a purpose. It has a purpose of controlling the cursor on the screen. We think it has that purpose because we built it to do that, right? So artifacts, we tend to think, well, those do have purposes. Why? Because we had an intention for them when we made them. And so they have the purpose of doing what we built them to do. And nobody questions that. Now, things get a little more dicey when you ask questions like, well, what about living things? Right? Now, sometimes living things only exist, particular living things only exist because we have a certain goal with them. Like if you're a dog breeder, you might have caused a certain dog to come into existence by bringing its parents together for a particular purpose, right? With a goal in mind. And so then there's a sense in which that particular dog could be said to have a purpose or a function. But what about dogs in general? Right? Do dogs exist for a purpose or a function? Now, in the case of dogs, you might think, well, maybe. I mean, dogs only really exist because of human activity. Dogs are like this weird in-between a natural category of thing and an artifact, because the way dogs develop is apparently wolves who were hungry started hanging out around human beings. And over time, this led to a new species being created, closely related to the wolf, but not quite a wolf. But the story here gets a little complicated because nobody intentionally did this to wolves to turn them into dogs. What happened was, over time, the wolves that were less likely to bite human beings, the wolves that were more likely to be calm around human beings, the wolves that were more likely to accompany human beings on the hunt and sort of like tip them off to where things were, those were the wolves we kept around. The rest of them died, or, did normal wolf things, which is not hang around human beings. And so over time, a bunch of small decisions to like, well, I'm going to keep this wolf around because it seems to not want to eat me, all together over thousands and thousands of years led to the development of dogs. So it's the result of human activity, but there was no intention behind it. Right? Nobody decided, well, let's decide together, we're all going to treat these wolves nicely so we can create a new species so that it can do certain things for us. Right? Nonetheless, there are people who say that dogs have a function. They're there to help hunt, they're there to guard us, right? And people, when they make that case, will sometimes point to the origin of dogs, right? That's what human beings originally found dogs to be good for. Now, if you think that dogs have a purpose or a function, and that purpose is some combination of hunting, guard duty, things like that, then you're going to have a way to tell a difference between good dogs and bad dogs, where a German Shepherd is a good dog, right? A German Shepherd can be a good guard dog. A hound dog is a good dog. It can be helpful in hunting. A Chihuahua is a useless animal, right? Or rather, it certainly can't help you hunt, and it certainly can't protect you. So if you think that dogs have a function or a purpose, you can use that to tell the difference between good dogs and bad dogs. Now, you might not think that dogs have a purpose or a function. You might think, look, we made them by accident, right? Human activity made dogs, but we made them by accident. So it's not like every dog needs to be a guard dog or a hunting dog, right? If you think that, you're probably going to be less likely to endorse the view that things like terriers, well, I guess terriers are useful for hunting, like varmints and stuff, but like Chihuahuas are not useful for hunting anything, right? You're less likely to think that Chihuahuas are an abomination and need to be wiped off the face of the earth, as you know, I do. I think that about Chihuahuas. But things become really clear when you start asking about animal or plant species that we had no role in creating. So if you ask about wolves, like what's the function of a wolf? You might be like, I mean, wolves don't have a function. They just are, right? What's the function of an oak tree? You think they're just oak trees. They're just there, right? They're just being oak trees. That's all. And that is a fairly modern way to look at it. Now, there are plenty of people right through till today who will tell you, in fact, the majority of people will tell you that no, everything has a purpose or a function because everything was created with a purpose or a function in mind because everything was created by God. And that way of saying that everything has a purpose or a function makes sense. It just becomes a question of, do you believe that there is a being who created everything on earth and did so with an intention in mind. Some people say yes, some people say no. Very often, people will read Aristotle and think, well, he must be one of the people who says yes. He must be one of the people who thinks God created the world with everything having its proper function and its proper role to play. Like there's a plan for everything, right? And that plan will tell you what everything's purpose is, and the purpose that everything has will tell you the difference between good and bad versions of that thing. People still make this argument quite a bit. It was very common, not quite as common today as it was like 10 years ago, but not that long ago, people were making an argument that homosexuality was immoral the following way. Thus, they said human sexual activity has a purpose or a function. That purpose is procreation. Any human sexual activity that doesn't further that purpose is defective human sexual activity. Right? That is an argument of the kind that Aristotle would have given. Right? You find that something has a function or a purpose, and so you say that something is good or bad to the extent that it fulfills that function or purpose. Now, that particular example is not one Aristotle would have agreed to. Homosexuality was very common in Greek society. I don't know of anywhere where Aristotle says there's anything wrong with it. Everyone Aristotle knew, maybe even Aristotle himself, I don't know, would have engaged in homosexual sexual acts. But that kind of reasoning goes along with Aristotle. And the people who engage in that kind of reasoning say, well, here's how we know what the purpose or function of human sexual activity is. The purpose or function was decided by God. Right? And when you look at Aristotle, it's very tempting to think, well, this is what Aristotle thinks. Because he says everything has a function. He also says there is a God, a single God. Set him apart from a lot of people in his time period. And that God is the cause of everything. So far it's looking like, all right, Aristotle has just a traditional theistic view. I mean, it wasn't traditional then, but it's traditional now. That God gave everything a purpose, and that's how you tell the difference between good versions of things and bad versions of things. There is this slight complication, though, that while Aristotle believes in a God who is the causal source of everything in the universe, Aristotle thinks God did that without any purpose. Or at least here's what Aristotle believes. God has never thought about any mortal creature, us included, because to do so would be beneath God's dignity. That God, being perfect, can only spend its time thinking about perfect things. But there is only one perfect thing in the universe, and that's God itself. So Aristotle believes God spends all its time contemplating God. God is a force in the universe, and in a sense, it created the universe by accident. By spinning, from what I understand. I haven't read that part of Aristotle too closely, but apparently God is a sphere and it spins, and the motion of God spinning caused the spinning of the rest of the universe, which caused everything else to happen. So the point I want to make here is Aristotle doesn't believe that everything that has a purpose gets its purpose because it was made with a goal in mind. He just thinks things have purposes. He just thinks everything in the world has a purpose. Every object, living or non-living. So there's a way to read Aristotle, from what I understand, it's the most common way to read Aristotle, where stones have a function or a purpose. That function or purpose is to get as close to the center of the universe as possible. And this, for Aristotle, is going to explain why stones fall to the ground. Right? They are engaging in the activity appropriate for their purpose or function. Because they're non-living, they can't do anything about that. Right? Non-living things just do whatever other forces act on them to do. And so naturally, stones will always fall towards the center of the universe. But if you pick a stone up, or it doesn't even have to be a stone, it can be any non-living thing. Here's a can of seltzer water. You pick this up, and I put it on a surface or something like that, right? Well, you don't need me to show you that. Well, here, we'll do it this way. Right? I have caused an unnatural thing to happen. I prevented it from going down to the center of the earth, this aluminium. That happens with stones because stones don't have the ability to do anything on their own. They don't act. Living things act because living things have a soul, or psyche, that's the Greek word. It's from psyche that we get the word psyche, from which we get the word psychology. Every living thing, Aristotle thinks, has a soul. And its soul, the nature of its soul, determines its function. And Aristotle says there are three basic kinds of living thing and three different kinds of souls. There are plants, and there are animals, and within animals, there's the beasts, there's rational creatures. Rational creatures is basically just human beings. But this corresponds to three different kinds of soul. There is, corresponding to plants, the nutritive soul. The nutritive soul is the kind of soul that you have that supports the kind of activities that plants engage in. Plants take in sustenance from the external world. They use that to grow and to spread, and that's all they do. I'm not sure what Aristotle would have thought of the Venus flytrap. I don't know if he knew about the Venus flytrap. I don't know if he knew about sunflowers. So, like Venus flytraps will trap flies and like slowly eat them. I mean, not eat them, they don't digest them, but like they do take in nutrients from them. And then there's sunflowers, which, move to track the sun. So there's a kind of motion there, but Aristotle thinks for the most part, here's what plants do. They get put in the ground and then they take in nutrients in order to build the complex structures that go along with that plant. Right? And they reproduce. That's an important thing. Beasts have let's call it the perceptual soul. Right? However, beasts also have the nutritive soul. They have both. The nutritive soul takes in nutrients, takes in energy from the outside world in order to grow and to propagate. The perceptual soul that the beasts have also takes in information from the outside world and uses that to guide its motion. Right? So motion goes along with perception. Aristotle seems to think that without perception, motion would be impossible. Right? Because you need to have information about the world you're moving through in order to move. So beasts have a nutritive soul and a perceptual soul. Right? Rational beings have a rational soul. But just like beasts have a nutritive soul, rational beings, us, have the perceptual and the nutritive soul as well. So in human beings, there's a three-part soul. This probably sounds familiar. It's similar to Plato, but there are different parts. So for Plato, it was the rational part, the spirited part, and the appetitive part. And for Aristotle, it's the rational part. So at the top level, you have the same thing. But then he has the perceptual part and the nutritive part. I'm just going to rewrite that. I apologize for the terrible handwriting. Now, the relationship between those two and how those two views of the soul differ, right? So they're similar in that they both have three parts. They're similar in that they have, each view has a rational part of the soul. They're similar in that the rational part is in some sense superior to the other parts. It's supposed to guide the other parts. They're different in that Aristotle is not going to go in for the same kind of distinction between appetite and spirit that Plato did, nor is it clear that what Plato calls appetite is all in the nutritive soul. Appetite seems like it's split up between the perceptual soul and the nutritive soul. In fact, the life of pleasure, which Plato associates with the appetitive soul, we've already seen Aristotle associates with the perceptual soul, or rather, he associates it with the beasts. Remember, he says that the life of gratification is one fit only for like beasts in the field. Well, the beasts in the field have a perceptual soul. They're doing the thing that's appropriate for them, which is they're guiding their life by the things they feel. That's what perception fundamentally is. You feel certain things. You can feel things visually, right? You can feel them auditorily, you can feel them olfactorily, you can feel them, whatever that word is for touch, I don't know, tactily, I guess. and taste. I don't know what the Lee word is for taste. Pleasure comes from those things. And so the life of pleasure is here in the perceptual soul. So Aristotle's going to give a slightly different analysis than Plato. But just like Plato, the nature of the soul is going to determine the nature of the good life, because here's what Aristotle's going to say. For a plant to be a good plant is for it to do the nutritive things well. A plant that can't take in nutrients very well, or a plant that can't grow, that can't turn those nutrients into what it needs to grow, a plant that can't reproduce is a bad plant. It's not doing the plant thing right. A beast that can't take in information, whichever way it happens to take in information from the outside world and use that information to successfully navigate that outside world, is a bad beast, right? But that won't just concern perception, right? That's just the name he gives to that part of the soul. What you should be thinking is that everything that goes into an animal moving around, being active, right, in the way that animals are supposed to be active, is all what goes into the function or the purpose of that animal. So you could have, for example, a tiger, right? A tiger with full sensory capabilities, all the things that tigers are supposed to do. So I imagine that tigers can smell better than us. I imagine that they can see better than us. Maybe they can hear better than us. I don't know. I have no idea about this. But let's say we've got a tiger who can do all the perceptual things that tigers are supposed to do, but the tiger can't walk anymore. Well, given that you only need the information from the outside world to navigate that world, then Aristotle would say the tiger is a defective tiger. It's not able to do the tiger things properly. And then we get to human beings. And remember that the nutritive part of the soul and the perceptual part of the soul are all parts of us too. We have those parts, but we have the rational part of the soul, and it's only from the rational part of the soul that we get our function. Why? Well, according to Aristotle, in human beings, as opposed to in plants or beasts, the nutritive part of the soul and the perceptual part of the soul only serve the rational part of the soul, right? They don't have sort of an independent function. All of what they are there for in us, not for other animals, but in us, is to serve the rational part of our soul. So as long as that still works, right? As long as you're capable of living a life that supports rational activities, Aristotle thinks you're fine, right? So it's very often thought that Aristotle is going to have some like really kind of gross ideas about disability, but I don't think that's quite right. Or rather, I don't think that's right for a wide range of disabilities, right? If you can't walk, I think if you were a horse, Aristotle would say, well, you're a shitty horse. But if you're a human being, Aristotle would say, well, can you live rational life? Can you do rational things? If the answer is yes, then they'll say, all right, turns out for you, you don't need that part. You don't need the walking part, right? The rational part of our soul determines our function. Nothing else does. And so he ends up saying, the good for human beings is what this all comes back to. The good for human beings is, and here I'll put it under here, a life of reason. And the idea is this is going to help us choose between these three lives. And as you can already probably tell, the life of pleasure is not going to come out very good here, right? Because you're not going to end up needing reason to live a life of pleasure. So the idea is looking at our function, which is determined by the nature of our soul, because we're a living thing, is going to help us determine what happiness is for us, because that's what makes us a good human being, and because that's what makes a good anything, right? The only way for a thing to be good is for it to fulfill its function. That's Aristotle's idea. And so if we fulfill our function, we're doing good. All right, I was about to go on to say some things. In fact, I did go on to say some things, and I recorded about 7 more minutes of this video, putting it over 30 minutes. What I'm doing now is going to put it over 30 minutes as well. But making it a little bit too long. Also, I realized after I was done, there was more content that I needed to discuss about the function argument. So I'm just going to put all that stuff into a second video about the function argument. It won't be as long as this one, but it'll be the function argument part 2.